You are currently in workshop number 5, organizing your block to not call the cops. This workshop series is a collaboration between Make Yourself Useful and ACRE, both in Chicago. Make Yourself Useful is a small collective focused on anti-racist work, with an emphasis on the active role of people with white privilege within movements for racial and social justice. ACRE stands for Artists Cooperative Residency and Exhibitions, and is perhaps best known for a yearly summer residency for artists in Steuben, Wisconsin. MYU is a collective, ACRE is a tiny nonprofit. All our work here is voluntary and unpaid. We are not quote unquote experts, but have experimented, fucked up, studied, and occasionally done a few things right. MYU and ACRE are scrappy and conversational versus institutional and academic. Neither of these things are better than the other, but we do not speak with authority on these matters and think it is important to own that outright. We are here tonight to humbly share our knowledge, what we have learned over the last 6+ years of engaging with formally and informally in the movement for Black lives. We come from an ethic that believes in the urgency of racial justice work, that leadership in these movements is most effective when held by those most affected, and that those who benefit from inherited unjust systems like racism have a moral and spiritual duty to act in opposition. This workshop is designed to give you some tactical strategies to effectively support Black-led movements for liberation. In this effort, we hope to also empower all of us to better act on our values of justice and liberation for all. So my name is Gwyneth, and I am an artist and I live in and work in Chicago. And I've been part of Make Yourself Useful since 2018.
Hi, I'm Kate. I'm an actor, director, writer, and mom living and working in Chicago. I'm brand new to Make Yourself Useful, but I'm very excited to be here. So welcome, all of you. In this session, we will be discussing how to reduce or eliminate instances of calling the police in our personal lives and in our individual neighborhoods. We will hope to provide tips to incorporate harm reduction into our everyday practices, tips for how to react and be present in situations where the police are called. Oh, someone is not muted. Okay, though. Recommendations for finding accomplices in your area who are committed to this work, and ideas for how to speak to your neighbors about not calling the police. We will often be reading along with the slides we are showing, and we realize this may be redundant for some of you, but we want to make sure that we are including those who are visually impaired, as well as those who just learn better through listening. If we can have the next slide, please. Abolition. An abolitionist vision means that we must build models today that can represent how we want to live in the future. It means developing practical strategies for taking small steps that move us toward making our dreams real, and that lead us all to believe that things really could be different. It means living this vision in our daily lives. That's from the Critical Resistance website.
Next slide. Ultimately, abolition is a practical program of change rooted in how people sustain and improve their lives, cobbling together insights and strategies from disparate, connected struggles. We know we won't bulldoze prisons and jails tomorrow, but as long as they continue to be advanced as the solution, all of the inequalities displaced to crime and punishment will persist. We're in a long game. And that's from Ruth Wilson Gilmore and James Kilgore in The Case for Abolition in the Marshall Project. Next slide. Being a good neighbor is abolitionist. Abolition is thriving because our organizational energies draw on local and international infrastructures of mutual assistance, like clubs, political organizations, faith communities, unions, and neighborhood associations, previous and ongoing rounds of long-term organizing, and widespread desires for greater democratic participation. Again, from The Case for Abolition in the Marshall Project.
Next slide, please. So a disclaimer, while we previously mentioned we are not experts, we want to echo that sentiment here. This presentation is a cobbling together of abolitionist recommendations and toolkits and teachings. This is our research that will ground us as we embark on the task of organizing our blocks to not call police. We plan to continue this work and support each other and hold each other accountable while we do so. So this is a rough sketch on how and why we plan to take this work on. There are likely many other ways to approach it, as well as many other nuances we haven't factored in since every block is unique. And if you'd like, we can stay in touch when and if you embark on this work on your own. Next slide, please. So we're going to start by going over the basic concepts of police abolition. MPD 150 created this zine. You may have seen it, it's been going around. It addresses common questions surrounding defunding the police. And here are a few of those images which address what we will be discussing tonight. So these are like questions that people often ask. Won't abolishing the police create chaos and crime? How will we stay safe? Police abolition work is not about snapping our fingers and instantly defunding every department in the world. Rather, we're talking about a gradual process of strategically reallocating resources, funding, and responsibility away from police and toward community-based models of safety, support, and prevention. The people who respond to crises in our community should be the people who are best equipped to deal with those crises, rather than strangers armed with guns who very likely do not live in the neighborhoods they're patrolling. We want to create space for more mental health service providers, social workers, victim or survivor advocates, religious leaders, neighbors, and friends, all of the people who really make up the fabric of a community, to look out for one another. And that is what we're hoping to do tonight in our further work, is to become those neighbors and friends mentioned here, people who know and care about their neighbors and can be helpful to them, not harmful. This applies to everyday interactions as well as in situations in which someone might consider calling the police.
Next slide. So another question, but what about armed bank robbers, murderers, and supervillains? Crime isn't random. Most of the time, it happens when someone has been unable to meet their basic needs through other means. So to really quote unquote fight crime, we don't need more cops. We need more jobs, more educational opportunities, more arts programs, more community centers, more mental health resources, and more of a say in how our own communities function. Sure, in this long transition process, we may need a small specialized class of public servants whose job is to respond to violent crimes. But part of what we're talking about here is what role police play in our society. Right now, cops don't just respond to violent crimes. They make needless traffic stops, arrest petty drug users, harass Black and brown people, and engage in a wide range of quote-unquote broken windows policing behaviors that only serve to keep more people under the thumb of the criminal justice system. So we hope to touch upon some of those situations in which the police are unnecessarily called and offer alternatives to engage with personally, and to suggest and offer to neighbors and friends. Next slide. But why not fund the police and fund all these alternatives too? Why is it an either or? It's not just that police are ineffective. In many communities, they're actively harmful. The history of policing is a history of violence against the marginalized. American police departments were originally created to dominate and criminalize communities of color and poor white workers, a job they continue doing to this day. The list has grown even longer. LGBTQ folks, people with disabilities, activists, so many of us are attacked by cops on a daily basis. And it's bigger than just police brutality. It's about how the prison industrial complex, the drug war, immigration law, and the web of policy, law, and culture that forms our criminal justice system has destroyed millions of lives and torn apart families. Cops don't prevent crime, they cause it through the ongoing violent disruption of our communities. Next slide, please. It's also worth noting that most social service agencies and organizations that could serve as alternatives to the police are underfunded, scrambling for grant money to stay alive while being forced to interact with officers who often make their jobs even harder. In 2016, the Minneapolis Police Department received $165 million in city funding alone. Imagine what that kind of money could do to keep our communities safe if it was reinvested. And so a quote from former Dallas Police Chief David Brown: "We're asking cops to do too much in this country. Every societal failure, we put it off on the cops to solve. Not enough mental health funding, let the cops handle it. Here in Dallas, we got a loose dog problem. Let's have the cops chase loose dogs. Schools fail, let's give it to the cops. That's too much to ask. Policing was never meant to solve all those problems." So we want to speak on that final quote from now Chicago Police Superintendent Brown. The positive is this quote shows that no matter where you are on the spectrum, from police abolitionist to police advocate, we can all agree that the police are called upon too often and in too many situations where options exist. We found that this quote is helpful in engaging with folks who are initially resistant to the defund movement. But this is the same man who recently called for longer jail sentences for, as he put it, quote unquote, those evil murdering bastards who commit gun offenses and deployed an additional 1,200 officers every day from Thursday to Sunday last weekend. We are in no way supporting him or his stance on policing. Next slide. So the larger picture of defunding the police relies on reallocating the typically bloated federal, state, and local funds assigned to police departments toward social services, education, arts programming, mental health care, and other civic projects and organizations who can create healthier communities. Healthier communities have a direct and profound impact on crime reduction. As part of the radically progressive vision that accompanies the central concern of abolishing the prison industrial complex, we must also develop systems and resources and infrastructure for communities to respond to crises with expertise and nonviolence. There's a lot we can all do with our voting and our voices and our dollars to support the movement on that level, but we are focusing tonight on more personal and local tactics. Bonus thought, less people calling on the police strengthen our case to defund.
Next slide, please. So, what are some situations in which people might call the police? What could we do instead? The first step, always, is to question your need to call the police at all, as this flowchart put together by Alternatives to Police shows. So, the first question you ask yourself is this merely an inconvenience? Is something I can put up with and be okay? To question your actual safety. And then if you can just look through the flow chart, kind of guides you to further questions to ask yourself before the police are called. Next slide, please. So these next situations and ideas were put together in tandem by the Mayday Collective in Brooklyn and Solidarity and Defense in Michigan. Point 1, don't feel obligated to defend property, especially corporate, quote unquote, private property. Before confronting someone or contacting the police, ask yourself if anyone is being hurt or endangered by property, quote unquote, quote, theft or damage. If the answer is no, then let it be. This is a major first step in identifying instances in which police are usually called. Recently, Amika Tendaji, a Chicago organizer and the co-founder of UMedics, asked in a panel put together by Vocalo, are you unsafe or are you uncomfortable? That idea will come up often tonight in a variety of ways, and theft and property damage is a really common one. Point 2, if something of yours is stolen and you need to file a report for insurance or other purposes, consider going to the police station instead of bringing cops into your community. You may inadvertently be putting someone in your neighborhood at risk. So for insurance purposes, yes, it is often useful to have a police report, but this is the least harmful way to engage with the police in that instance. Point 3, if you observe someone exhibiting behavior that seems, quote unquote, odd to you, don't assume that they are publicly intoxicated. A traumatic brain injury or a similar medical episode may be occurring. Ask if they're okay, if they have a medical condition, and if they need assistance. So the Treatment Advocacy Center states that people with untreated mental illness are 16 times more likely to be killed by law enforcement, and that reducing encounters between on-duty law enforcement and individuals with the most severe psychiatric diseases may represent the single most immediate practical strategy for reducing fatal police shootings in the United States. This instance may be one, though, in which we do feel unsafe and need to involve help, and we will go over some alternative resources if that is the case.
Next slide. So point 4, if you see someone pulled over with car trouble, stop and ask help, or if you can call a tow truck for them. If the police are introduced to such a situation, they may give punitive and unnecessary tickets to people with car issues, target those without papers, or worse. Pretty clear, if you have the capacity, help instead of harm. Point 5, keep a contact list of community resources like suicide hotlines. When police are contacted to quote unquote manage such situations, people with mental illness are 16 times more likely to be killed by cops than those without mental health challenges. Again, have options ready for how to manage situations involving mental illness. And then point 6, check your impulse to call the police on someone you believe looks or is acting quote unquote suspicious. Is their race, gender, ethnicity, class, or housing situation influencing your choice? Such calls death sentences for many people. This is personal work, and we all need in confronting and examining our prejudices and biases.
Next slide, please. Point 7, encourage teachers, coworkers, and organizers to avoid inviting police into classrooms, workplaces, and public spaces. Instead, create for a culture of taking care of each other and not unwittingly putting people in harm's way. If you're part of a group that's holding a rally or demonstration, don't get a permit or otherwise cooperate with the police. Cops in schools is a whole session on its own, and we're not going to dive any further into that, but man, could we. But something that we can do is to choose to not collaborate with the police in your institutional or organized activities whenever possible. That's a way to reduce the harm that the police may cause in those instances. Point 8, if your neighbor is having a party and the noise is bothering you, go over and talk to them. Getting to know your neighbors with community events like monthly block parties is a good way to make asking them to quiet down a little less uncomfortable, or to find another neighbor who is willing to do so. And this is where getting to know your neighbors is so essential in this work, being comfortable addressing them and not policing them, and recognizing that existing in your community but not engaging with it is an extension of privilege and reeks of colonial settler mentality. Point 9, if you see someone peeing in public, just look away. Remember, for example, that many houseless people do not have reliable access to bathrooms. Situations like this, in which houseless people are just trying to live their lives, is another place where we can confront our inherent bias and choose to interact or not with someone as a human being and not as a threat.
Next slide. So point 10, hold and attend de-escalation, conflict resolution, first aid, volunteer medic, self-defense workshops in neighborhood, school, workplace, or community organization. If the opportunity comes up or you are able to find such training and have the capacity, this is an excellent way to take personal responsibility in this work. Some examples are UMedics does urban emergency response training, the YWCA offers crisis intervention training, and there are some free online de-escalation technique training videos out there. So do a quick Google search, and we will also have some resources in our toolkit around that too. Point 11, street art is beautiful. Don't report graffiti and other street artists. If you see work that includes fascistic or hate speech, paint over it yourself or with friends. Another situation in which we can prioritize people, not property. And point 12, remember that police can escalate domestic violence situations. You can support friends and neighbors who are being victimized by abusers by offering them a place to stay, a ride to a safe location, or to watch their children. Utilize community resources like safe houses and hotlines. There are resources available to address domestic violence without calling the police. And again, we will provide some of these resources, but can also understand that it is intensely difficult to stand by when someone else is being hurt. If it is possible to have those neighborhood support systems and friendships in place before a crisis occurs, it is much easier to be of help to someone in a situation like this.
Next slide. So, questions for you. At this point, we would like to invite everyone to participate in answering these questions. You can engage with them personally if you'd like, by journaling or just sitting with them in your mind, or feel free to use the chat to share your responses. They can be really helpful for the group to see. These first two questions on this slide, if you want to share your answers, we do ask that other folks hold back on commenting on each other's responses. We will be making space for more interactive sharing with the next set of questions on the following slide that we'll get to. So, questions for all of us. Have you ever called the police? Why? What did you gain from calling the police? Do you know what the result of your call was for the other people in the situation? Question 2, have you ever chosen not to call the police when it seemed like an option? Why didn't you call them? Did you find an alternative response? What did you gain from that response? Do you know what the effect of that response was for the other people in the situation? So we're going to just take a minute now, that quiet space, for everyone to sit with that, to respond in the chat if you like, or just personally, and then we will move on.
All right, so that's 1 minute. Please feel free to keep adding to the chat what comes to mind for you. So next slide, please. For these next questions, we would love to allow for some group knowledge sharing. So feel for the edge of your own police calling, quote unquote, threshold. In what situations can you not even imagine calling the police? What is it that seems obvious to you to do instead? Are there any situations in which you feel it's necessary to call the police? Name the situation or type of situation in which you think you would call the police, where that response is, where that response is the only thing you can imagine doing or would be automatic. Sit with that threshold for a minute. Imagine the creative response that would allow you to move that threshold back a bit and generate a more creative, community-based response. What would you need? Who would be involved? How can you start to build that possibility? And that's from feeling for the edge of your imagination, finding ways not to call the police. So feel free to constructively and kindly respond to others' answers or ideas. These are big questions that we may not have any experience with, situations where we honestly don't know what we would do because we haven't been there. This is an exercise, not a test. We have Ruby and Carrie monitoring the chat, and they will respond and guide the conversation if needed. But we kind of hope to see where this will go and how we can all help each other to find solutions. We will take about 5 minutes now for this.
So we have from Kate, I could never imagine calling the police without attempting to engage and talk to a person first and find out if there's a way to avoid it. From Sasha, obviously situations where someone is being consistently violent and escalating, especially if they have a lethal weapon, are the hardest to imagine alternatives to. But just in seeing marshals at protests, it is so clear that there is strength in numbers, and having a lot of calm folks present to witness and de-escalate can be powerful. I did not call the police when I saw an argument and an assault. It's from Jesse. Both people were houseless. He threw her to the ground and threw her wheelchair. I picked up her wheelchair and brought it to her while 3 other bystanders pushed him away from her. She was angry that I did not call. I told her I did not want to call and for more harm to occur, and that I would wait with her if she felt she needed to call, and I would give a statement. Thanks, Karen, for the positive feedback. Madeline, I can't imagine not calling the police if someone was trying to break into my apartment. I recognize the importance of knowing your neighbors in this situation, but if no one comes to help, what should one do? So questions around like being alone at home and experiencing a break-in, or seeing like a really extreme expression of violence. Also in the case of, I have something coming in from someone about being in like a relationship where there's queer intimate partner violence and the cops are being homophobic and won't help anyways. Yeah, if anybody wants to weigh in on like if anybody's ever had the experience or has thoughts on this particular instance of being at home alone. I can offer one thing which is not comparable exactly, but it's coming up when I read that question. 2 summers ago, I was really close to my house and was coincidentally followed by 2 men, but like in a circular way so that I couldn't really get away from one without going towards the other. And I called a friend who I knew was close by and basically like went to a very like well-lit place on the street and just like stood with my back against the wall and waited for the person to come. So I do think that like this is another plug for getting to know your neighbors, or like knowing who's around in the neighborhood. It's obviously not like a completely sound approach, but it is one thing. And then we have more coming in. Yes, personal safety matters. If you knew the people, this is from Kate, if you knew the people around you or in your building, would you feel comfortable calling them first to see if they can help? It's an absolutely terrifying situation. Yeah, I mean, I think that this is one of those things where, and I think this has come up before, or maybe it's coming in the slides, but at a certain point you do have to like make quick decisions and weigh out the safety of your own personhood and your body in relationship to what could happen if you call the police. And there, unfortunately, because of the world that we live in, there might be times where you have to make that difficult choice. If you don't have anybody else you can call, or if it's clear that like the threat is so imminent, that wouldn't really be like an effective option. From Courtney, I get most uncomfortable with the thought of active shooter scenarios. The police don't feel like a solution here, but even thinking about abolition, this is often the spot where I feel uncertain. Are there ways to contact medical assistance without involving the police? That's a great question.
I answered that. We're actually going to be talking about that in just a bit, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Someone else has something on, oh, there's a lot in here. I probably can't read them all off in the time that we have. If anyone, oh, go ahead. If anyone else wants to jump in too.
Yeah, I will just highlight this one from, can you hear me? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
From Latham that he noted, I find it's helpful to think about the priorities as 1, harm reduction, and 2, not calling police because it reduces harm. There are situations that we might feel like taking a chance on calling police is our best option, and I personally think that's okay. This exercise is for us to get familiar with that threshold so we know it and know where our growth edges are.
I think it's important to note that that in an ideal world, these sorts of crimes would be diminished greatly as we move forward into creating social structures where people don't have the need to steal or to break in, certainly as often. But as you know, to echo what Latham said, there are absolutely situations in which your safety is compromised and you need help. And if that's the way that you can get the help, then you need to do what you absolutely have to.
I think that's the same thing for like active shooter scenarios or something like that. I think, you know, the long-term goal is like imagining a world where the US, it doesn't lead, you know, the world in as many active shooter situations as we have. I think that that's definitely a possibility.
I know Marissa also posted something about hearing a situation on the street, and that's a huge one for me as well. Is feeling like by not calling the police, you might be putting someone else in danger. Like I feel personally able to cope with any situation I've ever at least been in, but that because you don't know what's going on. But I think it's just important in that case to understand that given who they are and what the situation is, that calling the police may actually cause as much harm as it does help. And that doesn't feel right. But it's a very difficult situation. And not one that I personally have an answer to.
I've definitely had some luck before, just like, I mean, it's one of those things where you kind of have to like trust your instinct. And if it seems like the person who's being aggressive towards the other person is like potentially, like if there's the potential for them to be violent towards you, then this is not a good idea. But sometimes just like making a lot of noise or like yelling at the person, especially if it's like happening on the street and you can kind of like do it from your porch or from the window, that can scare them off. Or if it's happening in daylight, then maybe it's like, I don't know, I've had the experience where I like it's felt a little bit safer because there's people around, it's daylight, and you can just like say to the person like stop it, and that, yeah, it can be effective.
Or in that situation, bringing your attention to the person, and we'll get into this also more
Right.
in
This
the slideshow.
is
Yeah.
very much like the bystander intervention work that we'll be touching on in a moment.
Yeah, but I've been in those situations too, like on the street where there's something going on, and directing the focus at the victim or the potential victim to be like, hey, are you okay? And almost kind of like almost ignoring the other person. Sometimes that's helped. It really depends on the situation.
Suzanne, thanks for your question about as we work to defund police, can we also work to demand retraining of police to respond more appropriately to a variety of situations without threat or harm? I think that's a really great question, and it gets kind of to the heart of like how much effort and how many resources do we want to put towards things like reform versus full defunding and abolition. I'm seeing a lot of calls from Black organizers, activists, and leaders to kind of not mess with reform and not mess with retraining initiatives because they've happened before and they don't work. And actually in our previous workshop, we had some resources on that I believe are in the toolkit, and I can try to find them. But yeah, just wanted to respond to that. And if anybody else wants to add, please do.
No, I think that's good. I think some of these questions we will be kind of covering in the coming slides. Mm-hmm. So maybe we should move on, but by all means, like we'll have another opportunity for having conversation later. So Yeah, we aren't ignoring you. So yeah, thank you. So the next slide, please. And Kate, this is you.
A, I'm muted, and B, I was stuck on the previous page. All right, so this touches on some of the things actually that, like with what Marissa posted about bystander intervention. It's a great way to reduce harm in your day-to-day life without involving the police. And here are some slides put out by Hollaback that show wins and hows, and then the 5 Ds of bystander intervention in practice. So the first is just highlighting that we all play a role in creating safe public space by supporting each other when we're harassed. And that is what bystander intervention is all about. It goes on to talk about what different things that count as harassment, how we all have the right to be safe in public space, and that harassment can happen anywhere. And next slide.
So, of course, people experience public space differently. This involves our identities, who we are and how others see us, impacts our safety and public space and how we experience harassment. So just keeping that in, that we come to space differently.
Next slide, yeah. And here are some common reasons why people don't take action. If nobody else is doing anything, it's scary to be the only one. It's called the bystander effect. And being afraid that you'll make things worse. I totally relate to that. Thinking that something may be harmless when it's not, if you're not sure. Thinking that something is a cultural thing and something that you shouldn't get involved with, or the feeling that you can't make a difference or that it's not your problem. And so moving forward, here are some tips for moving to action and not letting these questions make you passive. Next slide.
So the 5 Ds of bystander intervention. The first one is distract. Take an indirect approach to de-escalate the situation. So you can say something like, excuse me, do you know what the next stop is? You can start a conversation with the target or find another way to draw attention away from them. Ask them for direction, time, or drop something even.
Next slide. The second D is delegate, get help from someone else. Find someone in a position of authority, like a bus driver, flight attendant, a teacher, or store manager. This one does touch upon talking to a security guard or involving possibly authorities that we are attempting not to, but it's still very valid. Check in with the person being harassed. This is a big point. You need to stay in contact with the person that you are deeming a target and ask them if they want you to call the police, which we have feelings about, but valid.
Next slide. So the next D is delay. After the incident is over, check in with the person who was harassed and say, are you okay? You can also say, can I sit with you? Can I accompany you somewhere? What do you need?
Next slide. And direct, which is just being direct with someone. Assess your safety first, but speak up about the harassment and be firm and clear. You can also talk to the person being harassed about what's going on. Ask, are you okay? Should I get help? Should we get out of here?
Next slide. And then document. It can be helpful for the target to have a video of the incident. Laws about recording in public vary, so do check your local laws first. And tips for documenting public harassment: keep a safe distance, film street signs or other landmarks that help identify the location, say the day and time when you record, and always ask the person targeted what they want to do with the footage. Never post it online or use it without their permission. Keep your attention on the person being harassed. Make sure anything is focused on supporting them.
Next slide. And this last slide really is from Hollaback about how to share your story and why. So it helps build a network of support by reminding others they're not alone. It gives other people and organizations important info on where and how harassment is happening, and amplifies the stories of targets and bystanders, and helps make harassment more visible. I think we've all been affected by recent videos of stuff going on that have caused us all to be here today. So it's important to share things that would be useful to other people to learn from.
Next slide. So here's a list of phone numbers you can call other than the police. Those with an asterisk are open 24/7. Please note that not all of these resources are aligned with the abolition movement, and calling them is not a guarantee that they will not recommend involving the police in a situation. We have been told that NAMI, N-A-M-I, the mental health resource listed here, will absolutely call police due to mandatory reporting. If you have additional numbers you can share, please put them in the chat. This list is by no means comprehensive.
The next slide, please. So sometimes the police will be called, and how can we be present to reduce harm in that instance? So the first step is simply to ask the person if they want you to be there when the cops arrive. This is if the cops are not there yet, but have been called. Respect their answer and do leave if they don't want you there. But if they're okay with you staying, ask if they would like you to document the police during the interaction. There are great resources out there for how to safely and legally record the cops. There's an article in Teen Vogue that's great. Berkeley Cop Watch out of California put together a PDF. It's mostly how to organize a cop watch patrol that actively seeks out to record cop behavior, but it has a ton of legal information that's useful as well in an isolated instance where you happen to witness something. And here are some basic instructions detailing how to record the police from Assata's Daughters. You can find further info at the URL there at the bottom, www.assatasdaughters.org/copwatch, specifically in, I believe it's in their resource section. So here are the things to do if you are recording the cops. When approaching an incident, do not get in the way. If officers get too close, say, I am a safe distance away, you are now violating my rights. If asked to step back, take one step back while saying and repeating, I am exercising my right to record and document police activity. Get this info, the location, officer's name, officer's badge number, precinct number, and the name and date of birth of the arrestee if they're willing to give that to you. Additional best practices: remain calm but firm, do not stay quiet, and keep talking continuously. And just so you know, if you do go to this link, this is available as a printable card that you can just keep with you, which can be helpful. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to talk on this before I start reading into it. If 911 is called for a medical emergency, this is kind of what we talked about before that someone asked about. If you call 911, the cops will show up. Sometimes someone may need that to get help, and you may need to get help to those people, and this outweighs the potential harm of having the police present. Sometimes people who need medical help or who see someone who does will call the police just because they don't know how else to get to a hospital, and that's a transportation issue. And if what someone needs is transportation to get help, either at a crisis center or at the hospital, ask if you can get them a Lyft or an Uber instead of relying on the police for transportation or advocating for them to do so. If transportation is not what is needed, here's an excerpt from a post relating one person's experiences with personal abolition, which details what you might do in this situation of being an observer and watching the police during 911 health emergencies. And I'm just going to read it. So if someone is hurt and you call 911, in addition to medics coming, so do the police. I have just hung out in these cases to make sure the cops don't fuck it up. In one instance, a young man was in distress. He was Black and straight up asked for help because he said he wanted to die. I called a suicide helpline while my partner at the time sat with him and kept him talking. I found a number, and I lost it when I broke my phone, and we'll try to find it again, of a service that does an EMT pickup without police. They sent the ambulance over, and sure enough, cops came. I was still on the hotline and was like, what the hell? She said, I swear I didn't call them. It was two big white dudes. I blocked them from going over to the guy. We got a call of domestic disturbance, the cop said. Not here, I assured him. I stood my ground, and he tried to push past me. That's my friend. I said, quote, that's my friend, and he needs to go to the hospital. unquote, I said. I tried my best to keep them away from the guy, but eventually they did exactly what they wanted. During this time, I was told later by my partner that one of the EMTs asked the guy if he had any weapons or drug paraphernalia. The guy handed over his knife and bowl. The EMT pocketed it because this man did not need to be arrested. He needed to be cared for in a mental health ward. The cops were, sorry, I've got the chat window up and it's in the way. The cops were all over him with questions, but eventually the EMTs got him in the ambulance and he got the care he needed. We visited him in the hospital, talked to his mom, and I hope he's okay. So this was just a social media post from a community member named Molly Brennan in June of this year. And I can attest that Molly Brennan is a badass and has no problem physically intervening if the police are involved. And we may not all be there, and that is absolutely totally fine. But I think there's some really useful tips in here. No matter what level you are, you feel comfortable engaging. And by the way, I don't know, I have not been able to find that number she references about getting trained medics who won't come with cops attached. If anybody has any idea about that, please put it in the chat. And also the fact that the EMTs that arrived took this man's pipe and knife is something you absolutely may not be comfortable with yourself doing, but maybe asking that person who's about to interact with the cops if they have anything that they might want to hide or toss themselves might be useful in that case, because obviously there'd be a lot going on and they may not think about their own personal safety in that way.
Next slide. So when we look at moving on from personal practices in not calling the police to quote unquote engaging with our communities, it is essential to recognize that there are probably people and organizations around you that have been doing this work for many years. You can't help your neighborhood if you don't know your neighborhood. And this is where recognizing and contacting those services that already exist comes in. Ask yourself, who serves your community? What sustains your community? Who else is interested in abolition, restorative justice, transformative justice, and immigrant justice in your area? Places to look might be community centers, mutual aid networks, religious and cultural organizations, educational organizations, mental health facilities, shelters, and food banks. Just Googling the name of your neighborhood and the term social services will lead you to organizations. Study their websites and look for language that gives you a sense of their attitude and connection to the police. Then make a list of a few and reach out. Good things to look for are links to resources for crisis intervention other than 911 or city or state services, and resources for undocumented community members who might already be fearful of police involvement in their lives. These groups can help guide us to already established alternatives to calling the police and already created networks that we can join in order to be part of our communities. For those of us in mainly white neighborhoods, it is important to get to know our BIPOC neighbors and not project our assumptions of their position on the police while we try to spread the word to everyone about these alternatives. For those of us who are white and living in predominantly non-white neighborhoods, it can be really easy to risk falling into white savior mode in our desire to take action. In WBEZ reporter Natalie Y. Moore's article entitled "How to Be a White Neighbor in a Black Neighborhood," she says, "Don't come in with a savior mentality hitched to your moving truck. Don't start your own block club, join the existing one. Recognize and respect the history of your neighborhood, do some research, and be prepared to take a backseat to those who are most affected by the criminal justice system and the movements to reform or abolish it." Criminal justice reform advocate Glenn E. Martin said, "Those closest to the problem are closest to the solution, but furthest from resources and power." It is our job to leverage our privilege to help bring resources and power to those who know what to do with them. Okay.
Hey, muted again. On a day-to-day basis, how can we go about getting to know our neighbors and building networks and relationships that would lead to reducing calls to the police? The answer to this is not easy. We all live in different neighborhoods. We have different levels of comfort just talking to people, but just taking occasional walks and being friendly while doing so is a huge first step. Saying hi or smiling, which is an ability unfortunately lost due to COVID with a mask on, but people could see it in your eyes. That's a start. And for a next step when you're out and about, what do you notice in your neighborhood? What clues can you use to find a point of connection with people? Things like gardens, pets, cars, music, sports, weather, they can all be points of contact to open a conversation and make it easier to feel a sense of community with the people around you. Or if there are signs on someone's lawn or in their window, ask where someone got them. If the sign is contrary to your views, like we call the cop sign, would you maybe feel comfortable asking about it? And how could that conversation go, which wouldn't lead to you alienating each other? We don't want to alienate our neighbors, obviously, by engaging in conflict with them. So we've discussed how to do this ourselves at length, and there is no right way. But one thing that we all agreed on is that conversations about not calling the cops will be much more successful if you already know the people you are talking to about it.
Next slide, please. So if you have the capacity to hold an event that would lead to getting to know your neighbors, this is a great way to build community. So you can just look through this list. I'm not going to read this slide, but asking if anyone on your block wants to hold a communal yard sale or a block party, for instance, can be a starting point for conversation and will hopefully lead to an event that could be a huge step in coming together. If you have a garden overflowing with tomatoes or herbs, consider sharing them. Gestures of generosity are incredibly effective in forming connections, and bonus, they tend to feel really good too. And if somewhere in all of this, find just one person you feel comfortable discussing the problems with policing with, fantastic. And maybe from there you have yourself an accomplice who might be able to help you go further. We don't want to create relationships with an agenda here. Authentically building or joining a community is the goal in itself. But once a community is strong, everyone involved can better address the needs and wants of the people within that community and help be a part of reducing harm.
And next slide.
Oh, so this is a piece of art by Monica Trinidad, who is a really rad artist in Chicago. And Monica's part of the For the People Artist Collective. Next slide. And here's another piece of art by Monica. And we're gonna rest here and do some more questions and quandaries. Feel free to post in the chat and we will engage.
That's a great question, Madeline. Any tips for community engagement in the time of quarantine? Feel free to weigh in. My first instinct with that question is, I think now more than ever, people are looking for a connection with people, with other people, with neighbors who are in close physical proximity. So I think talking to your neighbors, asking them how they're doing. Jack has the joining mutual aid in your neighborhood or neighborhood Slack text channels comment. Yeah, there's so many mutual aid groups that didn't exist before, or if they did are now popping. So let's see, I live in Humboldt Park and I'm not a Spanish speaker. Does anyone know or have any friends who might help translate some of this content into Spanish? That's a great question, Margot. And Margot, maybe you can clarify, are you talking about any specific information that was presented in this workshop, all of it?
Truly, yeah, whatever is, I mean, some of it seems like it's handy to have in the moment, or flyers to spread around, or really anything to kind of get a conversation started, but have it be multilingual, so.
Yeah, I think that the best approach there would be to, if you haven't already connected with the mutual aid group in Humboldt Park. I'm not personally familiar, but my guess is that it's a bilingual group. I know where I live, The mutual aid group in Rogers Park is bilingual. And yeah, I think that would be a great place to like start asking those questions, because it's possible that they already even have like similar aligned resources.
Yeah, Lily posted a Humboldt Park Solidarity Network is bilingual.
Oh,
so.
cool. Thank you. Yeah, I think with COVID right now, like the mutual aid groups are totally the silver lining when it comes to making these kinds of connections. Just reading through. Any ideas about when you hear elder abuse by an adult child next door? From Sean. That's really tough. Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on your relationship with that neighbor, if you have one, or if you know other people on the block who might have a relationship with that neighbor. I think talking with them would be a great place to start and be like, hey, do you know what's going on? I'm really concerned.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're like their history in the neighborhood like goes way beyond mine. Like they were raised on the block and have been around far longer than I have, and so there's like I guess there's like a seniority thing there, and me, of course, not knowing, you know, like all the inner workings of their family and their household, of course, because I'm just a neighbor, but like other neighbors, like knowing that and telling like, oh, like, hey, don't worry about that, it's normal, you know, like that kid had it rough when, you know, whatever, like 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And now it's just coming full circle. And I'm like, shit, like I don't I don't feel like I have the, what do you say, the place or the, you know what I mean? I don't feel like I have the right to comment on it, but in the same way, at the same time, I feel like, hey, like these are like someone's being treated badly. You know, I'm not in a place to judge whether or not anybody deserves anything, but like, you know, I've never called the police, but I still don't know how to approach that.
Yeah, thanks for explaining more about the situation. I'm really not sure. I mean, I think that there's like quite a few different approaches you could take. Do you ever see the person?
Yeah.
The elder?
Both of them, the elder and the younger.
I was like in a similar situation where there was like a domestic violence situation a few doors down, and I befriended the person who was like experiencing it and just tried to check in with her as much as possible. And I'm not really sure what effect that had in the long run, but that's one idea, is just like trying to build a connection with the person who's experiencing this.
Yeah, it's rough because she's not mobile, and the only time I ever see her is out, like when she is with the person that is abusing her, like once every couple 2-3 months, right? But I'm not trying to like pose an unsolvable question. I was just wondering if anybody had any tips or ideas. That's it.
Yeah, I think in general, with like any sort of like domestic violence, the best thing for that person is to not be isolated. Yeah, I think, you know, if you can establish a relationship with them, or if you do know where they are, where they live, giving resources like a hotline, anything like that, you know, I would, you know, caution against like ever involving, like, you know, it would, not for elderly people, but like, you know, with a family situation, like I would caution against like calling DCFS or anything like that. But yeah, I think, you know, trying to provide resources in a safe way, or, you know, I mean, the best thing is, you know, for the abuser to know that they don't have like a you know, like a social stranglehold on this person, that they have access to other other, you know, family or friends.
Yeah, and and I know, sorry, I know that this is focused on race, but just one last quick question, just because it's, you know, violence in the neighborhood, is how to, I guess, somehow slip that info to someone when you never see them without their abuser.
Yeah, I mean, that seems really hard. I mean, I think the only thing would be like if you had their address, you know, like
Yeah.
if you knew where they lived and put something in their mailbox or something potentially. But
Cool.
you know, otherwise, I really, you know, that's a really hard one. But you know, maybe, you know, if it's possible to talk to them even when they're with the abuser, just being like, hey, how are you? I see you in this neighborhood. You know, maybe that's like a way to start. I don't know.
Sasha brought up, I think
Thank you.
mutual aid groups do wellness checks, potentially also My Block, My Hood, My City.
Right.
I can post a link to them. But yeah, I think like being in community with the local mutual aid group near you, Sean, is also a great way to like think through this with people who are familiar with the neighborhood or familiar with the block, and like can perhaps people, like you said, who have seniority and have been there longer but might see it differently than some of the neighbors you mentioned who were like not having the same viewpoint that you have about this being an actually abusive situation.
Thank you.
And yeah, wellness, I know like in Rogers Park, they're doing like COVID related wellness checks. So it's possible that that could be used as like a guise to do a potential elder abuse kind of wellness check.
And
Yeah, I
speaking
mean,
of a, go ahead, Kate.
Oh, I was just going to say that I can definitely report that this is another situation of mandatory reporting. So any state or city sponsored organization that you would be guided to help will call the police because it's mandatory. And I do know that there are some civic organizations working to change that and to distance themselves from police intervention, but it's not there yet for sure.
Yeah, I know that a lot of like, what do you call it? IPOs, like independent political organizations in different wards that are mostly progressive, are currently offering a lot of like elderly check-ins and other kind of community support. And yeah, depending on where people live, like, yeah, if anyone has a similar situation, we can try to seek out those resources and contact numbers to help out. But yeah, other questions. Thank you so much for the
Oh, that's an excellent.
One other
Appreciate you.
thing I was thinking, Sean, is I wonder, I don't also know how much exposure you have to the abuser in this situation, but it seems like building a relationship with that person would also be really useful, both in terms of like de-escalating and creating a pleasant atmosphere for that person, so that maybe it like minimizes whatever stress that they would then take out on the elder. I don't know how much you would want to take on, but it seems like it could be a strategy. And then if that person builds trust with you, there could be a way to build a relationship with the elder down the line.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about it. Yeah, maybe in a sidebar in a little bit down the road. I want to make space for other folks. Thank you, Linnea.
Thank you. I think we will just kind of finish up the last few things, but everyone will be invited to stick around as long as they are able to chat further. So we just want to say thank you, all of you, for joining us. We're about to wrap up. We want to honor everyone's time, but feel free to stay after if you'd like to participate in some conversation, as just said. All links are in the resource toolkit. However, to close out, we're also going to drop a very important link for Chicagoans in the chat. This is unfortunately just Chicago specific, but it takes you to a Google Doc with ongoing actions, protests, needs for donations, and a host of other resources for what we can all be doing to sustain momentum in this movement. It is constantly updated and it's really good. It also has some national information, so if you're not in Chicago and want to check it out, please do. And if you'd like to participate in a group text thread aimed at providing a support network for ongoing anti-racist work, please enter your phone number with the area code in the chat, and you can always opt out later down the line.
So we'll add the link to the recording of this session in the resource toolkit shortly, as well as on our website. Documentation from the first 4 sessions will be linked there as well shortly. They're on our YouTube currently. We will also be sending out a brief survey, which will help us understand how this session was or was not helpful. We'd super greatly appreciate your input. And then one final plea, please donate to Assata's Daughters if you can. A link to their donation page is in the chat. So
I just posted it again, so it's right there.
thank you. So thank you all. Stay safe, be in touch, take care. And next slide. Oh yeah, we're here. Now let's get to work.
Well, let's get to work. Thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you.